Finally, at long last, we can affix a date to our pain. For on Tuesday, September 14th, California voters, young, old, dead, and non-citizens alike, will go to the polls and decide whether or not Gavin Newsom's governorship should be taken to the French laundry, shall we say. And I wanted to talk about this tonight because everyone seems to have a dim to non-existent understanding of how this process works. And look, if you're someone from the national media who's just too lazy to look things up, which I believe is nearly everyone in the national media at last count, then I guess that's understandable, or at least unsurprising, if not necessarily excusable. But when I talk to people who actually participated in our last gubernatorial recall election, which lest we forget was only 18 years ago, and their understanding of the process seems just as dim to non-existent as that of the news media dumbshits, then I think it's time to devote an opening segment on a Friday, and happy Friday, by the way, to doing a bit of California Recall Election 101. So I'm Mr. Curmudgeon, and I'll be your instructor today. Okay, so first things first. Newsom does not have any opponent in this election, and second thing is second. Let's please stop using terms like Republican challengers, because just as there are no opponents in this election, there also are no party affiliations. This election has absolutely no partisan component to it whatsoever. I know that's weird, but just try to go with it. There will be two questions on the ballot in this election. The first question is a very simple yes or no referendum. Shall Governor Gavin Newsom be removed from office? And that is exactly what it will say on the ballot. The other question, the second question, is a free-for-all to select Newsom's replacement in the eventuality that the voters answered the first question in the affirmative. And literally anybody who collects the requisite number of qualifying signatures gets to have his or her name on the ballot, or its name, or their name, because I'm not here to be transphobic or mispronoun anybody, because what kind of monster do I look like anyway? Now, as I recall it from the last recall election, the one where we threw Gray Davis out on his dull, unexceptional ass, although if we're being honest, by comparison, Gavin Newsom makes Gray Davis look like a towering paragon of statesmanship and effective governance. But there were something like 165 names on the ballot in that election, as I recall. The ballot was really more like a pamphlet or a small magazine, more so than a ballot. And no, if you're wondering, I didn't vote for Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I never believed he was going to be a significant upgrade over Davis, which he, of course, was not. My final two were Larry Flynt and Gary Coleman, both of whom have since sadly passed on to the great hot tub party in the sky. And in the event, on election day, I voted for Larry Flynt. And when I tell people that, they sometimes react very strangely. Some of them will just scoff and assume that I'm bullshitting, but it's the God's honest truth. I voted for Larry Flynt for governor of California in 2003. And say whatever you want about the guy, but I maintain he would have been a better governor than either Gray Davis or King Gavin the Gravel Gargler. And some of the other people, when I tell them that, they react with something pretty close to anger when I tell them, voted for Larry Flynt in the 2003 recall. They just sometimes start clutching their pearls in great consternation because how could you ever vote for a filthy pornographer? What were you thinking? Well, I'll tell you why. Because that filthy pornographer was also one of the most important free speech activists of the second half of the 21st century. And he took not one, but two different cases all the way to the Supreme Court, the results of which were victories for the cause of human liberty in ways that have nothing at all to do with asses and tits. And the most important of the two cases, and it's not the one that they made the Woody Harrelson movie about, was the later one. The one from, I want to say it was 1987 or 88. The decision wherein the court held that government officials and public figures do not have any right to not be mocked or satirized so long as the thing you're doing is clearly an act of mockery or satire in the eyes of the average reasonable person. Because Hustler had published a comedy article where George H.W. Bush, who was still vice president at that time, he was talking about like Barbara's favorite sex positions, stuff like that. It wasn't even very funny. It was just vulgarity for vulgarity's sake. But the U.S. government actually filed a lawsuit and wanted the courts to rule against Larry Flynt and Hustler and say that you can't publish comedy articles about the fictitious sex habits of powerful, famous people. And if that case had been adjudicated differently, you think the Babylon Bee would exist today? You think half the channels on YouTube would exist today? As it is, satirists are under concerted assault from the media Democrat big tech complex. And then that decision in that case that was brought by Larry Flynt back in 87, 88 is the biggest and best arrow in their legal quiver right now, preventing them from being silenced and deplatformed. Because imagine all the people in Washington and Silicon Valley and elsewhere who would love to see that decision overturned tomorrow so they could start summarily banning all satirical content that mocks people they like. And yeah, I know I still haven't explained why Gary Coleman was my other finalist that year in the recall election. And the reason for that is twofold. One, because Different Strokes was fucking awesome. And two, because I wanted my final pair of candidates, my finalists, to be men who could see eye to eye with one another. Now, Jim Eagle, I want you to hit something appropriate for the start of Independence Day weekend. In fact, give me some John Philip Sousa. Play it nice and loud so they can hear it all the way at BLN HQ. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where if I see you trying to be ironic by wearing an American flag face mask this weekend, I will slap you, and I will enjoy it. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, and we need to talk about failed policies and the failed politicians who failed at them. And then we need to ask ourselves why we are still living under those failed policies. The year was 1990. And the aforementioned George Herbert Walker Bush was the occupant of the White House. The Tiananmen Square uprising had taken place just the previous year, during Bush's first 6 months in office, in fact. And what a damn shame it couldn't have taken place 1 year sooner, when Ronald Reagan was still in office, when all the Chinese people needed and wanted was the public support and affirmation of the American president and the American government. But in the event, that support was not forthcoming. All we got from Bush 41 was a bunch of generic, mealy-mouthed prevaricating about the general value of freedom and democracy and human rights, but nothing specific about China. Now, when it was time for the American president to act like the leader of the free world, to muster the resolve and the moral courage that Reagan displayed when he simply said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," his successor proved himself either unwilling or unable to muster that same courage and that same resolve. And it was a devastating defeat for the cause of human liberty, the ramifications of which are still being felt today, all across the world. But it was also a devastating political setback for the new president, who was never really an ideological ally of Reagan, although lots of people forget that today, but he owed his presidency and his continued support among the members of the Republican base to his ability to portray himself as Reagan's loyal heir and the guardian of the Reagan legacy. And when you're trying to be Ronald Reagan's successor, when your chances for being reelected hinge on getting Reagan's voters to like you and continue liking you, refusing to take a decisive stand for freedom and against communist tyranny is not really a good look, needless to say. But at the same time, in the first year or two of his presidency, Bush was being helped by the fact that the Soviet bloc was actively in the midst of collapsing. The Berlin Wall was coming down. European communism was defeated without a shot being fired, except maybe the shot that Nicolae Ceausescu took in the back of the head, but that's neither here nor there. And President Bush didn't hesitate to bathe himself in the glory of Ronald Reagan's accomplishments, just as Nixon never had much compunction about taking credit for the Apollo program, just as no president has really ever hesitated to claim the credit when one of his predecessors' policies winds up producing a desirable result. But none of that made the China thing go away, frustratingly enough, because Bush, let's call it what it was, he had backed down like a spineless coward. He had pointedly refused to lend his public support to hundreds of thousands of young Chinese people who had packed every square inch of Tiananmen Square crying out for freedom and democracy. And whose flag were they waving while they were doing it? I'll give you one guess. What statue were they making papier-mâché replicas of? Again, I will give you one guess. These people were saying to George Bush, we want democracy, we are ready to overthrow our government, we just want to know that you have our back. Now, it's important to emphasize here that these people were not asking for military support or anything like that from us. All they wanted was for the President of the United States, the ostensible leader of the free world, back when there was something we called the free world, back when we made a distinction between freedom and communism, to publicly say, yes, I think the Chinese people deserve to live in a free and democratic society, and yes, I support the overthrow of any communist regime because we're America and we love freedom. It should never be difficult or controversial for the U.S. president to utter those words. But alas, George Bush could not bring himself to utter them. And of course, it's pointless to get too much into speculation about how differently things might have gone if Bush had uttered those words. It's entirely possible that a full-scale uprising would have been put down and suppressed with the same level of brutality that was employed in the clearing of Tiananmen Square, in which case we would have the same status quo that we have today, and the only thing different would be the size of the 1989 body count. It's also possible that China would have had that an uprising would have kicked off another Chinese civil war, lasting the better part of a decade or more, with the communists prevailing just like they prevailed in 1949. But the third possibility is that a democratic revolution would have succeeded. And in that eventuality, here in the year 2021, communism would no longer exist. It would have been relegated to the dustbin of history's failed ideologies, right where it damn well belongs, 30 years ago. And maybe it's worth allowing ourselves to contemplate, even just for a moment or two, how much less upheaval and suffering and death the world might have experienced in 2020 and 21 if George Bush the Elder had been able to locate his testicles in the early summer of 1989. But alas, the events unfolded the way they did, and by 1990, a year after the embarrassment of Tiananmen Square, Bush and the congressional Republicans came up with a plan to slather some lipstick on that pig. And what they did in that moment was the genesis of the normalized trade relations that we today still have, bizarrely, inexplicably, counterintuitively, with our foremost global strategic adversary and our probable opponent should a third world war happen to break out. And the thinking went something like this. Let's go and grant most favored nation trade status to China, and this is a status that we previously had only bestowed upon our closest allies, countries that we've fought and bled with in wars together. But we'll do that, and once the Chinese people get a little tiny whiff of delicious Yankee capitalism, then China will magically transform into a Western liberal democracy. We will defeat Asian communism without firing a shot in anger, just like we defeated European communism. Everybody will forget about that Tiananmen Square debacle. George Bush will be resoundingly reelected, and Bob's your uncle. Now, there is a distressingly common belief today that if we did not have normalized trade relations with China as we do, then we somehow would have no source of cheap, crappy, disposable products. But the people who think such things ought to disabuse themselves of those notions, because even pre-1990, when there were effectively zero Chinese products on the shelves of any American store, we still had no shortage of cheap, crappy, disposable products. The only difference was they were just made in Mexico or Malaysia or El Salvador instead of being made in China. And there was also a significantly diminished likelihood that the pair of Nikes you just bought was manufactured by actual, honest-to-God child slaves who were chained to sewing machines for 27 hours a day. Now, the people who dreamed up this plan, this 1990 plan, of whom there were Democrats along with Republicans in the group, they never mentioned anything at the time about this strategy taking over 30 years to yield results or to succeed. They never mentioned anything about part of the plan being to throw our country's gates open to any and all manner of Chinese spies and intelligence operatives, and I'm looking right at you, Eric Swalwell and Dianne Feinstein, or allowing our national security to be compromised, or basically inviting the theft of any and all intellectual property that China can get its hands on, or politely applauding while our professional sports leagues and some of our highest profile consumer brands retool themselves as sort of barely veiled PR functionaries of the Chinese Communist Party, which is really weird and creepy, and I wish they would stop. But every single year, the U.S. Congress has to reapprove and reaffirm China's most favored nation trade status. They have to take a vote on that one thing every single year, and every single year the bill comfortably sails through with little or no debate. And why is that? When are we allowed to start asking the question, how does this policy benefit the people of the United States? What dividend have the American people gained by our Congress rubber stamping this sweetheart trade deal for China year after year after decade, seemingly in perpetuity? It's not difficult, of course, to see all the ways in which China has profited from this deal, because it's been the greatest thing that ever happened to them. But when America's leaders sign trade deals on behalf of the American people, aren't they, the American people, supposed to gain at least some theoretical benefit from it? So where is the benefit? What has my country gained by communist China having most favored nation trade status for 3 whole decades? Because if the desired effect was to elevate China to the status of a world superpower, while at the same time degrading our own strategic position at an inversely proportional rate, then I think it is fair to say that the scheme has been quite a resounding success indeed. Now, if you've been watching this program for any length of time, then you know I am no great fan of the Republican Party, and you're probably also aware of my belief that American conservatism is effectively doomed if it persists in continuing to hitch its wagon to the ossified corpse of the GOP elephant. And Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, yesterday I thought he offered us just a wonderfully elegant object lesson in why I think what I think about the Republican Party and the people who run it. Now, the House Democrats wrote a bill which basically gets rid of most or all of the statues on the Capitol grounds that, if they depict any person who at any point in their life said or did something that is morally objectionable according to the standards of 21st century woke leftist identitarianism. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like people who call themselves conservatives, they ought to be staunchly opposed to and to stand against the erasure of our cultural memory and the destruction of public artworks. But Kevin McCarthy didn't do that, because he is the type of Republican who would never dream of doing something that might make someone on CNN call him a racist. He is the type of Republican, and make no mistake, they still run that party, and they most likely always will, who thinks being a conservative means you just have to stay safely to the right of whoever the craziest person on the left is at any given moment. The type of Republican who is congenitally incapable of not fighting the battle on a field of the opponent's choosing under a set of rules that he alone devised. So McCarthy proudly votes for this stupid iconoclastic bill. He votes for the statues to be pulled down. He votes in favor of woke leftist identitarianism and the wholesale erasure of our national memory. And what does he offer by way of a justification for this? Well, he points out that the statues on the tear-down list, they're all statues of Democrats. He thinks he's struck such a great blow here. He is so pleased with himself. Like he thinks he's playing 4D political chess, and he has just totally owned Pelosi. He appears to be actually operating in the belief that the Democrats are not aware of their own hypocrisy, that they care about taking intellectually incoherent positions, because what rock have you been living under if you think that, Mr. McCarthy? And what would it take to get a Republican leader in the House who is willing to stand up and say, no, I don't support that statue being torn down, and I don't care if the guy it depicts is someone you think was a racist? But will that ever happen? No, it won't ever happen. So don't go getting your hopes up too much. Now, one of the stupidest labels in our current national political discourse is the label Rhino, Republican in name only. Like real Republicans are supposed to be principled small government conservatives. When is the last time that was true? Because it sure as hell has not been true at any point in my lifetime. In my life, there have been two great Republican presidents, Reagan and Trump, and each man succeeded more in spite of the GOP than because of it. From where I sit, the Republican Party hasn't succeeded in doing much of anything in the past 30 years except losing the culture war and drifting ever leftward and just maintaining that little as long as we're this far away from the craziest person on the left, then we're still conservatives. Now, it seems to me that if anybody was a rhino, it was Reagan and then it was Trump, because they both stood against the GOP establishment. So why do so many of us continue to persist in the belief that the Republican Party is the only game in town if you're a conservative? You only have to concede one or two more lost election cycles in order to be rid of the stupid GOP forever. I still think, I will always think, that Trump should have run for re-election last year as an independent, because neither he nor his voters has ever gained anything from being affiliated with the GOP. Moreover, I think he should enter the 2024 race as an unaffiliated write-in candidate. Go ahead and call me crazy if you want to, but cut all the corrupt party machines and election officials completely out of the equation. There's your campaign pitch. Want me to be your president? Write in my name. If he does that, and the election is something close to being a free and fair one, he will win. And he will be the guy who vanquished the 160-year Republican-Democrat duocracy once and for all. Which, if I know anything about Donald Trump, I feel like that's something he would enjoy having on his tombstone. His gold-plated tombstone, of course, naturally. It's the biggest, most powerful tombstone in history. Many people have said that. Nobody's ever seen a tombstone like it. And with that, I will be back on Monday with the story that I've been saving since Memorial Day. I think you'll enjoy it. Until then, here is wishing you and yours a very delightful, edifying, patriotic weekend. Happy birthday, America. Let freedom ring. Get off my lawn.